Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the House says the name Laken Riley through H.R. 7511, the Laken-Riley Act. On this day, 2 weeks ago, the life of a 22-year-old nursing student, Laken Riley, a beautiful and vibrant young woman, came to an abrupt and shocking end, a totally unnecessary end, when she was abducted from her morning run around Lake Herrick Trail on the campus of the University of Georgia in Athens and brutally killed, beaten to death and to a state of disfigurement by a criminal alien whom Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas were under legal obligation to detain. Laken's failure to return home alarmed her roommate, who called police. Police found her discarded body in the woods off the running trail, her skull crushed. Last Friday, Laken's parents laid their daughter to rest, their lives destroyed by the senseless and depraved actions of a criminal who should not have been here, and the callous indifference of the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Venezuelan Jose Ibarra illegally entered into our country across the southwest border in 2022. The Biden administration released him just like millions of others, paroled him into the country to roam wherever he pleased, rather than detaining him as the law required. Jose Ibarra roamed to New York City. There, in August, NYPD arrested him for driving a scooter without a license, with a child on board, unprotected by a helmet. And an independent obligation arose for Homeland Security to detain Mr. Ibarra, namely, that he had committed an offense involving moral turpitude by endangering that child. But NYPD released him, and Homeland Security did nothing. From New York City, Jose Ibarra roamed to join his brother Diego, another criminal illegal alien, in Athens, Georgia. Athens police arrested Diego in September for driving while intoxicated and without a license, also an offense involving moral turpitude, which required detention by Homeland Security. But Homeland Security again did nothing, and Diego too was promptly released. In October, Jose and Diego joined forces to rip off the local Walmart, and it must have been quite something for them to be arrested for shoplifting in this day and age. But arrested they were, and another basis in law arose for mandatory detention. Specifically, 2 or more criminal offenses by each of them involving separate criminal acts. Again, Homeland Security utterly disregarded Congress's statutory command and did nothing. The Ibarra brothers were set free upon the community again. In December, a final chance came to prevent Laken Riley's fate. Athens police arrested Diego again for failure to appear for a fingerprintable offense. Why didn't they arrest Jose? Who knows? Maybe they figured, what's the point? Homeland Security will just continue looking the other way. Even though Diego was also now an absconder, he was released again. And the big bureaucratic Department of Homeland Security did nothing. Secretary Mayorkas asked whether Jose Ibarra should have been deported before he beat Laken Riley to death, answered blandly that his agency, quote, works closely with law enforcement to ensure individuals who pose a threat to public safety are made the highest priority for detention and removal. Which reminds me of the more than 30 times Secretary Mayorkas testified to Congress under oath that the border was secure. What the Secretary omitted to explain was the law he laid down in September 2021, the memo to the Department of Homeland Security employees, where he instructed that the grounds specified by Congress for detention would never be the basis standing alone for any detention by Homeland Security. The law, according to Alejandro Mayorkas. Today, the Laken-Riley Act presents 2 simple and straightforward amendments to law to break through the Biden administration's brazen defiant, and reckless disregard for Laken Riley and all the other vulnerable Americans out there victimized already or soon to be victimized. First, it specifies theft offenses as a ground mandating the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody criminal illegal aliens like Jose Ibarra and to issue a detainer request to local law enforcement. How hard is that, right? Shouldn't illegal aliens required to be detained at the border in the first place, who go on to engage in thievery in our country, be detained and removed? Who could disagree with that? But if H.R. 7511 only added another detention mandate to the slew that Secretary Mayorkas is brazenly defying even today, it would be an act of futility. More statutory commands to an administration that is lawless, and it would do nothing to honor the life and memory of Laken Riley. Therefore, the other essential element of this bill is to confer standing upon state attorneys general to bring civil actions against open borders executive branch officials who refuse to enforce the nation's immigration laws. This provision comes from H.R. 7322, the Sue for Immigration Enforcement Act, introduced by me and by Chip Roy. It will empower states to hold Homeland Security accountable in federal courts for flouting mandatory detention requirements, the limits of parole authority, and visa sanctions against countries that refuse to cooperate with repatriation of illegals removed from our country. This responds to the Supreme Court's ruling 2023 in United States versus Texas that states lack standing in such cases. And it follows the roadmap set forth in the court's opinion in that case, inviting Congress to cure this standing defect by specifically authorizing such suits in statute. The provision confers standing upon a narrowly defined set of plaintiffs, the states, and authorizes the judiciary to grant redress. As such, this legislation will ensure that harmful abuses of our immigration laws, in fact, those policies set forth by the Biden administration that are in direct conflict and contradiction with the plain meaning of our laws, will not go unchallenged. H.R. 7511 also honors Laken Riley's life and those who mourn her loss, as well as all of the other victims of the Biden border crisis. No law passed by this body can bring back Laken or take away the pain suffered by her family and countless other victims of criminal alien crime. The Laken Riley Act, however, will ensure that illegal aliens who commit theft offenses, as Laken's alleged murderer did, cannot be shielded by the Biden administration's continued reckless, callous indifference. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start by expressing my deepest condolences to Laken Riley's family. The pain of losing a child is something no parent should have to go through. The alleged perpetrator should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. By all accounts, Laken was a kind and gentle soul, beloved by everyone around her. May her memory be a blessing. Unfortunately, instead of coming together to express our sorrow for Laken's tragic loss, the majority appears to be exploiting her death for yet another partisan political stunt. The legislation before us today would subject to mandatory detention any undocumented immigrants merely arrested or charged with committing an act of theft, larceny, or shoplifting, along with I skipped a page. Rather than approaching this tragic event in a thoughtful manner, Republicans appear to have just thrown together language from existing unrelated bills that target and scapegoat immigrants to score cheap political points in an election year, while doing nothing to address the situation at the border. This approach is fundamentally unserious. As if to emphasize the point, the author of this legislation spent the weekend promoting anti-Semitic memes on Twitter. At base, this bill is a rinse and repeat of the majority's unserious attempt to keep immigration in the news. pick a crime, paste it into a template bill with sweeping, unrealistic immigration consequences, then require detention and deportation of certain immigrants merely accused of committing such a crime. No due process required. All so that you can demonize immigrants and sound tough without actually making this country safer. The legislation before us today would subject to mandatory detention any undocumented immigrants merely arrested or charged with committing an act of theft, larceny, or shoplifting, along with those who are convicted or who admit to committing such acts. Let's think about that. Someone who is arrested, who was never even charged with a crime, is now going to be subject to mandatory immigration detention? The case of Laken Riley is a tragedy, but as is often said, hard cases make bad law. Under this bill, committing a misdemeanor shoplifting, or even committing no crime at all, can result in a DACA or TPS recipient, someone who may have been in this country for decades, being subject to mandatory detention. Sadly, there are countless real-life examples of people getting arrested because of mistaken identity. Through erroneous witness identification, biographical similarities to perpetrators, and errors caused by faulty facial recognition technology. In a markup we had in the Judiciary Committee last month, Mr. Massey discussed how mistaken identification can deprive someone of their constitutional rights. He noted very real concerns about racial disparities in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools. These tools have led to numerous erroneous arrests, mostly of people of color. For example, just over a year ago, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified as the perpetrator by an automatic facial recognition search. She was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested. After being held by the police for 11 hours, she was released on a $100,000 bond. It took a month and 2 hearings for the case against her to be dismissed. Under this bill, however, if this woman had been on DACA or TPS status, ICE would have been required to detain her upon her release, and her U.S. citizen son would have been born in immigration detention, even though she committed no crime. Mandatory detention of innocent people is not a reasonable or sensible policy choice. This is not where we should be focusing our limited enforcement resources. It is important to remember that this bill would subject more people to mandatory detention at a time when Republicans refuse to give the Department of Homeland Security the resources it needs to carry out its policies. The Biden administration is currently detaining 39,000 people a day. That is 5,000 more people than Congress has even provided funding for it to detain. Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever requested, sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the, quote, mandatory detention, unquote, categories. Even former President Trump never tried to detain all migrants subject to mandatory detention. House Republicans know this, but instead of facing that reality and providing the resources necessary to address weaknesses in the immigration system, they would prefer to demagogue the issue, and they bring us measures like this. If that weren't bad enough, this bill also purports to give state attorneys general standing to sue in court for perceived violations of certain sections of the Immigration and Nationality Act, hoping to convince the judicial branch to impose the draconian immigration policy preferences that MAGA Republicans have failed to get through the political branches of the federal government. This bill simply declares that states have standing to sue so long as the state or its residents suffer almost any degree of harm, no matter how trivial, appearing only to exclude financial harms that are less than $100. And we should note that this provision is almost certainly unconstitutional. Just declaring that there is standing does not make it so. Just last year, the Supreme Court addressed the issue of states standing to sue the federal government over immigration enforcement matters, which this bill appears to be a half-baked attempt to circumvent. In an 8-1 decision, the court held that Texas and Louisiana lacked Article III standing to bring suit against the federal government over its alleged violation of some of the very same immigration statutes that this bill would purport to grant standing to the states to sue over. In rejecting the state's standing argument, the court noted, among other things, that lawsuits alleging insufficient arrest or prosecution run against the executive branch's Article 2 authority to enforce the law, which includes the discretion to determine enforcement priorities in the face of lack of resources and shifting public safety and public welfare needs. This bill also goes directly against the Supreme Court's settled precedent in Spokio Inc. versus Robbins, which explicitly states that a statutory right to sue does not constitute an injury for purposes of standing. But settled precedent, much like responsible governance, doesn't seem to matter much to the majority. Time and again, Republicans have refused to engage in bipartisan immigration reform. At the behest of Donald Trump, the Republicans dismissed out of hand a bipartisan Senate border bill that Senate Minority Leader McConnell called the strongest border bill in 30 years. In October, the Biden administration sent Congress a supplemental funding request, which included an additional $14 billion for border security. House Republicans refused to schedule a vote on this funding request, which would provide the Biden administration the resources it needs to secure the border and would provide additional support for communities receiving migrants. Both these bills would have allowed the Biden administration to hire thousands more asylum officers and immigration judges, so asylum hearings happen in weeks, not years. This would help put an end to what my Republican colleagues refer to as catch and release, a procedure in immigration law that has been used by every administration for decades. And what they mean by that is you catch someone, but because of lack of resources, his court date is 3 years from then, and so you have to release him pending the court date because he has a colorable claim to asylum. But if the appropriation that the Biden administration had requested, this could be done in weeks, not years, and you wouldn't have the problem with catch and release, so-called catch and release. All they can point to is H.R. 2, which last week got a grand total of 32 yes votes in the Senate when it was brought up for a vote. Instead of rushing yet another partisan stunt to the floor, the majority should work with Democrats to pass bipartisan solutions to address the situation at the border. That would be a far better way to truly honor the lives of those we have tragically lost. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank my friend from North Carolina for yielding. Mr. Speaker, just 2 weeks ago, at the hands of a violent, illegal alien, we lost yet another American life, a beloved daughter, student, and Georgian. This has been heartbreaking for the family, our communities, and this nation. That is why I stand before you today and rise in strong support of H.R. 7511, the Laken Riley Act. Laken was an outstanding student at Augusta University's nursing school in Athens, which was well on her way to a successful career helping others and saving countless lives, all to be cut brutally short by a vicious criminal. This should have never happened and cannot happen again in this nation. In fact, this could have been prevented had the Senate passed H.R. 2 and secured our border. It is the responsibility of Congress and this administration to make sure every American can live in this country safely and we be a law-abiding nation. Not only is the suspect in Laken Riley's tragic death here illegally, but he also has a criminal record that includes shoplifting in Athens, Clark County. Allowing this criminal to freely roam our communities was absolutely unacceptable. H.R. 7511 will ensure illegal immigrants who commit theft are detained by ICE rather than released back into these communities. The bill will also allow states to sue the federal government for failing to enforce our borders. I am sick of President Biden's and liberal officials across this country not enforcing current law. It is beyond me how anyone can support the sanctuary and catch and release policies that have attracted illegal aliens to these communities, just like the one responsible for taking Laken Riley's life. In fact, the president has statutory authority to secure our border. I strongly urge a yes vote on this important legislation to protect our nation. Robin and I and our family continue to join all our fellow Georgians in this nation in praying for Laken's family and loved ones. She will not be forgotten, and I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield to the gentleman from Maryland, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Ivey, such time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 7511, the House Republicans' unconstitutional attempt to violate the separation of powers doctrine. While I take issue with many aspects of this bill, I'm particularly concerned about this bill, that this bill is a blatant effort to overturn the Supreme Court's 8-1 ruling in the United States v. Texas, and wrongly blames the Biden administration for 3 decades of border enforcement challenges. In the Texas case, states sued the Department of Homeland Security about border enforcement. Justice Kavanaugh, a Trump appointee, writing for the 8-1 majority, stated that Texas did not have standing in its lawsuit against the federal government. He wrote, "The threshold question is whether the states have standing under Article 3 to maintain this suit. The answer is no. This bill does not change the Supreme Court's clear ruling. Determining whether states can bring suit in this type of immigration case is a power that is vested in the federal courts, not Congress." Justice Kavanaugh also made clear that the discretion to arrest and detain aliens is a power granted to the executive branch, and that, quote, "The executive branch does not possess the resources necessary to arrest or remove all of the non-citizens covered by the federal immigration laws. That reality is not an anomaly, it is a constant." Kavanaugh noted, in addition, that for the last 27 years, quote, "all 5 presidential administrations have determined that resource constraints necessitated prioritization in making immigration arrests. That means DHS cannot detain everybody. So the executive branch, not the states, have to make choices. Unfortunately, this bill would not give DSH the resources to change that. Instead, House Republicans rely on political stunts like impeaching Secretary Mayorkas, even though that won't fix the problem at the border. The bipartisan Senate bill that the House Republicans refuse to even debate actually would help to address these problems, but they won't bring that bill to the floor for a vote. If they did, it would pass. That's because we all know we need more border agents and more judges to eliminate the backlog of immigration cases. But the Republicans are not proposing more resources or any legislation that might truly make a difference. I thank the gentleman for yielding. This bill is not a serious attempt to address the actual border security needs, and as such, I would urge my colleagues to oppose it. Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the chairman of the subcommittee on immigration integrity and security and enforcement of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Laken Riley's death was foreordained the day that this administration took office and reversed the successful Trump policies that had finally secured our borders. Since that day, just 3 years ago, more than 6 million illegal aliens have been allowed to enter our country, a population the size of the state of Missouri, our 18th largest state. Very little is done to vet these millions of illegal migrants. We don't know how many terrorists or violent criminals are among them, and worse, this administration seems not to care. But we do know that the number of suspected terrorists that we're apprehending has skyrocketed, and that violent international crime cartels and violent foreign gangs are now operating freely in our communities, often protected from deportation and detention by the Democrats' sanctuary laws. One of these criminals is now accused of the brutal murder of Laken Riley. How many such monsters has this president allowed into our country? We do not know, but we're slowly, painfully, and tragically finding out victim by victim. In this case, the suspect was paroled into this country through a shocking abuse of power by this president. He was repeatedly arrested for theft and other crimes in sanctuary jurisdictions, and each time released back onto our streets. The bill before us would require this administration to detain illegal aliens who commit theft, burglary, larceny, or shoplifting, something it simply refuses to do, and it would also allow states to bring civil action against federal officials who refuse to enforce these laws. Today, the name on the bill is Laken Riley. Tomorrow, it will be another victim of these policies, another son or daughter or loved one. And it won't stop until this administration is stopped. And that can only be done by the American people. I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I don't reserve.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
The previous speaker said that illegal aliens who committed crimes should be detained, and indeed they should. But this bill says that illegal aliens whom somebody thinks may have committed a crime should be detained mandatorily. That is un-American, and I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Mr. Speaker, I stand in support of the Laken Riley Act. And first, I want to express the sincere condolences from everyone in the 7th Congressional District to Laken Riley. Then candidate Biden promised in 2020 that we'd have open borders, and we've seen the devastating consequences, and it's happening all over the country. In January, a father of 3 daughters was killed by an illegal alien in my congressional district in northern Wisconsin. Once again, this illegal alien should have been deported by ICE agents when he was first convicted of drunk driving in 2023. And once again, the Biden administration chose not to deport him. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, this is hardly a surprise. In fact, in 2020, Joe Biden himself declared, "I don't count drunk driving," when asked what crimes should merit the removal of illegal aliens. And he is not alone. As we all know, just a few short weeks ago, 150 Democrats in this chamber voted against legislation to deport criminal aliens convicted of drunk driving. Mr. Speaker, the sad truth is that both Laken Riley and Stephen Nashholm's deaths were preventable.
Reserve.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our hearts do go out to the family of Laken Riley. And now, we also must acknowledge that we can no longer take the feigned, empty words of sympathy from those across the aisle who refuse to do something meaningful to stop the onslaught that is happening in America today. Let's think about this. You need to acknowledge you haven't done anything. You sent to us a foreign aid bill that you've claimed is a border security bill. It is no such thing. But let's face this fact as well. Let's face the fact that the law requires detention already. The detention provisions of Title VIII are civil in nature and not criminal in nature, and that's why there's already authority and mandates to hold people in custody when they haven't been convicted of various acts, such as drug distribution, prostitution, other vices. This bill simply adds another criminal offense into a civil construct. Let's admit that you don't want to stop that. Let's admit that you don't really want to secure the border. If you wanted to secure the border, if this administration wanted to secure the border, There is authority under Title VIII right now to enact border closure procedures. This administration has allowed people to come in running rampant. This administration should apologize to the family of the 11-year-old girl who was raped last week by a Guatemalan illegal alien who should never have been released from custody. This happens over and over again. It's time now to stand up and say you support this bill and you're going to begin to take action to bring the border under control. If you want to talk about parole, we could go into a lengthy discussion about parole. But I'm not going to go into a lengthy discussion. I'm going to yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from North Carolina yields.
I reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Lincoln Riley is dead because of Joe Biden's policies. There's no words that I can say that will bring her back to life. There are no words that will bring back State Trooper Christopher Gadd. There are no words that will bring back 16-year-old Elizabeth Medina. There are no words that will bring back all those who've been brutally beaten, murdered, and damaged by illegals who were let out on parole. But for God's sake, pass the Lincoln Riley Act, and President Biden stop paroling illegals over and over again. Stop killing our Americans. Stop hurting our Americans. I yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from North Carolina yields. Reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Congressman Bishop. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 7511, the Laken Riley Act, and our hearts do go out to her grieving family today. This bill is in remembrance of Laken Riley, the 22-year-old nursing student who was tragically murdered in my home community of Athens, Georgia, by an illegal alien who should never have even been in the United States. After illegally entering the country, Laken's murderer was arrested by the NYPD in September of 2023 for acting in a manner to injure a minor and for committing a motor vehicle license violation. Also, according to an Athens Clark County police report, this illegal alien went on to shoplift in Georgia the following month. Clearly, this illegal alien had a pattern of criminal history, one that started when he accepted Joe Biden's invitation to illegally enter our country and do so under an abuse of the parole system. He should never have been allowed to reside in the United States illegally, and ICE should have immediately issued a detainer after he committed these crimes. Because ultimately, if ICE had issued a detainer, this illegal alien would never have been in the United States to commit the horrific murder of Laken Riley. We must enact changes now to protect communities across the country from facing additional avoidable tragedies. H.R. 7511 provides a common-sense solution to do just that. This legislation requires ICE to issue detainers and take custody of illegal aliens who commit crimes like theft, burglary, and larceny. But the local jurisdiction, the Clark County Sheriff's Office, would also have to recognize and act upon the ICE detainer. And when you have a sanctuary city like the Athens Clark County Unified Government, ignoring these detainers makes them a magnet for criminal illegal aliens. So I call right now on Athens Clark County to publicly reject their sanctuary city policy. If they did, it would be a strong step in the right direction toward preventing our citizens from becoming future victims of illegal alien violent crime. Additionally, the Laken Riley Act contains within it Representative Dan Bishop's own legislation that just last week passed out of the Judiciary Committee. It is called the Standing Up to the Executive Branch for Immigration Enforcement Act. So, my friend, I want to recognize your part in making this legislation happen. These important provisions that Rep. Bishop authored give state attorney generals standing to bring suit against DHS Secretary Mayorkas, Secretary of State Blinken, Attorney General Garland for violating certain immigration laws that harm the state or its representatives or its respective citizens. Rep. Bishop's legislation also allows for appropriate injunctive relief and expedites the disposition of such civil actions. This important legislation is critical, and as a co-sponsor, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the Laken-Riley Act. After all, one of the most formidable ways that Congress can deliver justice to the Laken-Riley family
Gentleman's time has expired.
Is by passing this legislation. Thank you.
I reserve.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Laken-Riley's future was taken away from her and she from her family because an illegal immigrant in the state of New York was arrested and released, my home state. My colleague across the aisle knows this full well. Because of policies put in place by this administration, embraced by governors like Kathy Hochul in states like New York, we have surrendered our southern border and made our communities less safe. It is important to move on this piece of legislation, and I encourage my colleagues to support the Laken-Riley Act. But I also ask my colleagues, especially those from New York, to take serious the challenge that has been made worse and communities less safe because of cashless bail, catch and release, and sanctuary city policies in the state of New York. I ask them to join me in calling on Governor Kathy Hochul, instead of talking about it, taking action to rescind cashless bail, reform, catch and release, and end sanctuary city policies to make safe the people and communities of the state of New York. And with that, I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my friend from North Carolina for yielding. And it's so important that we have this debate on the floor and that we pass the Laken-Riley Act. It would be more significant if later tonight, in this very chamber, if Joe Biden joined us and said that he was going to finally take action using the same pen that on day one when he became president, he used to undo all of those actions that were securing our border, if he would say he's going to reverse those actions. He can work to restore the Remain in Mexico protocol, getting us back to a functioning asylum process. He could take direct action with his own pen, no act of Congress, to end catch and release, so that when people come here by the millions as they have, they're not just allowed to go into the interior of our country, where we don't even know where they're going. Governors can't tell you how many people have come into their states illegally, where they're showing up. You see it in cities where they're showing up and they're shutting down schools and gymnasiums to house people. This is out of control, and Joe Biden created the mess. He could solve it. But short of Joe Biden solving it, the House has taken multiple actions to address it. This Republican House came together last year to pass H.R. 2, a bill designed to actually secure America's border. Taking all of those necessary actions, whether the president wants to or not, but doing the things that it takes, working with our Border Patrol agents to secure America's border so that we don't have what we've seen, at least 8 million people that have come across illegally. And when you look at some of the devastating consequences, Laken-Riley is just one example. And I pray for her, and I pray for her family. No family should have to go through what Laken-Riley's family is still grieving with today. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this is not even an isolated incident. It's happening over and over again in communities all across America ever since Joe Biden opened our southern border, allowing millions of people to come in. You're seeing countries emptying out prisons to send people here. People on the terrorist watch list, over 140 that we know of on the terrorist watch list, that have been detained? How many that we don't know of, that haven't been caught, that are here in America planning to do us harm because Joe Biden opened the southern border? There are serious negative consequences to those actions that Joe Biden took. When you think about Kenner, Louisiana, a community in my backyard, part of which I represent in my district, just days ago, a 14-year-old girl was raped by someone here illegally. You saw just recently a 2-year-old murdered by someone here illegally. How many more communities are going to have to suffer? How many more families are going to have to be victims before Joe Biden admits this problem and then works with us to solve it? Not passing a bill like they tried to in the Senate that actually makes it worse, that codifies things like catch and release, that gives over $1 billion of your taxpayer money to fund lawyers for people here illegally. Yes, that was in the Senate bill that even the Senate didn't pass after all of that hoopla about a bipartisan coalescence. They didn't even pass that bill once they read it. The House did pass a bill to solve this problem. Today we're coming together to pass another bill here with the Laken-Riley Act to solve this problem. But the worst part of it is this problem should have never happened if Joe Biden didn't take the steps he took with a pen to open this southern border. He could close it himself. He chooses not to. We came together and said, then we'll close it, Mr. President, and he issued veto threats on those bills because he wants an open border. But does he want the consequences too? Will he look those families in the eye and tell them enough is enough and apologize to them? He could do that tonight from that podium. I sure hope he does. But in the meantime, what he really needs to do is work with us to end this madness, to secure America's border, get back to a functioning legal system of immigration in America, like every other country has, so that we don't see this endless flow that's devastating communities all across America. Let's pass the Laken-Riley Act, and hopefully there will be no more examples like Laken-Riley in the future. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanking the gentleman, I reserve.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Scalise and the other Republicans are not serious about solving the problem we all talk about. Mr. Scalise says the solution is H.R. 2, a bill so serious it received 32 votes in the United States Senate, a body with 49 Republican senators. If the Republicans were serious about solving this problem, they would vote the $14 billion that the President has requested to hire more Border Patrol people and more judges so that asylum decisions can be made in weeks and not years, and you wouldn't have the problem of catch and release. If Republicans were serious, they wouldn't have tanked the Senate bill developed by negotiations including principally Senator Lankford, who is considered the second most conservative senator in the Senate. And that bill was going to be agreed to until President Trump decided, or former President Trump, and hopefully never again President Trump, decided that he'd rather have an issue for the campaign than solve the problem. So he told the Republicans to tank the bill that they had just written. So let's talk about hypocrisy. That's what we're hearing in this chamber. That's what we hear all the time. A party, Republican Party, that loves the rhetoric, that loves to use the victimhood of people like Laken-Riley for political purposes, but a political party, a Republican Party, that does not want to solve this problem, will not take any serious step to solve this problem, and is trying to create a fraud on the American people by pretending that it cares about this problem. I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now recognize yield 5 minutes to the gentleman who represents Athens, Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Representative Bishop, for yielding. Colleagues, I'm proud to have introduced the Laken Riley Act and urge you to join me in voting to pass this bill today. As Joe Biden comes to the Capitol tonight to defend his atrocious record, the House is voting to rebuke him for the open border policies that led directly to Laken Riley's murder. Y'all, enough is enough. The President and the DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas have released millions of illegal aliens into this country, and they refuse to secure our border and keep Americans safe. Unfortunately, the man who murdered Laken was among those millions. Despite committing several crimes and multiple jurisdictions, he was allowed to roam free in America before brutally murdering Miss Riley on the campus of the University of Georgia on February the 22nd. Folks, Laken was only 22 years old, a nursing student. She had her whole life and a bright future ahead. And this young woman was an exemplary daughter, sister, and friend. She was cherished by so many people for her loving nature and her servant's heart. And she would be with us today if elected leaders who took an oath to preserve our Constitution and faithfully execute our laws had kept their word. But they didn't. While we can't bring Laken back, we must now turn our focus to doing everything we can to prevent this from happening to another American. The Laken Riley Act is a key piece in our fight to restore the rule of law and get criminal illegal aliens off our street. This legislation will give Immigration and Customs Enforcement more tools. It will add theft to the list of crimes for which the agency must detain and deport an illegal alien. This is crucial. Many people who commit petty crimes go on to commit worse crimes. Laken's murderer, Jose Antonio Ibarra, is a prime example of this. Ibarra was cited for shoplifting in Athens, Georgia, just prior to murdering Laken. But under current law, ICE would not have been required to pick up Ibarra, even if local law enforcement had reported him. Y'all, let's change that. Let's also give states the legal recourse when the federal government fails to enforce immigration law. The Laken Riley Act does that. States will be able to sue the federal government for injunctive relief when illegals released into this country harm our people. Lastly, the bill condemns the president's border policies and calls on him to end catch and release, reinstate remain in Mexico, and secure the borders of the United States. Colleagues, today we act on behalf of those who are no longer with us because of Joe Biden's policies. I thank you for rallying alongside of me to highlight Laken Riley's life these past 2 weeks. Let's continue to pray for her family and friends as they grieve her loss and resolve to continue to fighting for the American people against the lawlessness created by this administration. I urge you to join me in voting yes on the Laken Riley Act. And when it passes, I also urge my colleagues in the Senate to take this up immediately. Let's ensure justice for Laken Riley. Thank you, and I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I'm prepared to close as well, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to close where I began, by expressing my deepest condolences to the family of Laken Riley. I only wish that we were debating a bill worthy of her name. Instead, we have the latest Republican press release, a bill that serves as an excuse to target and demonize immigrants while making our country no safer. I hope that my Republican colleagues will change course and choose to work with Democrats and with the administration in a constructive manner that improves our immigration system and makes our border more secure. Until then, I must urge members to oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 7511 is but the latest effort by Republicans to do something about the harm that confronts our nation from an uncontrolled border by the determined action of President Biden and Democrats. H.R. 2 is an extensive bill with many provisions and extensive reform. Democrats have ignored it. This bill is exceedingly simple and straightforward. Democrats attack it. The excuses for doing nothing never end. The only answers offered by Democrats are to spend more money, processing more aliens faster into the country, making the problem worse. And yet they always deflect blame to someone else for the calamitous results of their policies. This bill is very straightforward. The objection that a thief should not be deported until after a conviction leaves Americans to be victimized for all the time that would happen until a conviction. It's not required under the law. The distinction between the point the gentleman from New York made about Mr. Massey's bill concerning the use of facial recognition technology, that's about American citizens. The people involved here have no right to be in this country. They're not supposed to be here. They also object that the standing change, that the conferral of standing on state attorneys general is unconstitutional, will not work. But it is Justice Kavanaugh, in the opinion of the court in United States versus Texas, who said, for example, Congress might specifically authorize suits against the executive branch by a defined set of plaintiffs who have suffered concrete harms from executive under-enforcement, and specifically authorize the judiciary to enter appropriate orders requiring additional arrests or prosecutions by the executive branch. This bill takes that invitation from the court to act. It's far past the time for President Biden to act. He will not act. Let's act in this United States Congress. We have the chance to give states the ability to fight back. We have the chance to recognize Laken Riley's story as a tragedy. There need not be other tragedies. I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes on the Laken Riley Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.